Do you ever find yourself listening to podcasts about autism but feel like you don't quite relate to everything, but then you listen to ADHD podcasts and feel like that doesn't quite fit you either? Well, that might be because you have both.
Oh, great.
Welcome to my channel. If you're a returning subscriber, statistics show you are likely 10% more awesome than the general population on average. So welcome back, you awesome person, you. If you're new here, hi, my name's Jen, and on this channel I make content about being a female diagnosed with autism and ADHD. In this video, I'm going to go over what it feels like to have both autism and ADHD. If you're like me and you have the dual diagnosis, you've probably discovered by now that most podcasts or online sources only talk about one or the other as a standalone condition. Unfortunately, there aren't a ton of resources on what the two look like together. You might also have joined some Facebook groups for just autism or just ADHD because you were seeking community and support, and while you find yourself relating to some of the things, you somehow feel completely different and like you don't fit in with them at the same time. For me personally, it began to feel like I was trying to fit a square peg into a round hole with either diagnosis because there were common symptoms of both that I didn't have. If you've ever felt that way, you are not alone. These mixed feelings combined with lack of resources have led many to struggle with feeling imposter syndrome because they don't completely identify with one or the other. If you thought the autism spectrum was spectrum-y, imagine expanding that circle outward to also encompass ADHD traits. As you can imagine, this is a pretty in-depth subject, but I'll give it my best shot at providing a general overview. If you find yourself relating to a lot of what is said in this video and you've not yet been diagnosed, it might be worth considering that you could be a part of the ADHD club. Now, I do have a college degree, but it's not a PhD, so please don't listen to me for diagnosing your reality. I am not a doctor, you guys. I can share my lived experience with you here, as well as share bits and pieces of information that I've combed from theinternet.com that I think are pertinent. But this video is not intended to be a diagnostic tool. Before we get into the traits, let's look at some of the facts and history of having both conditions. First, let's look at some of the studies regarding the prevalence of having the two conditions at the same time. The percentages vary from study to study, but some have suggested that anywhere from 30 to 80% of individuals with autism might also have ADHD. The prevalence is lower for the reverse, meaning there's less of a percentage of people diagnosed with ADHD who also have autism. But again, even at the lowest end, it's suggested that 1 in 3 people diagnosed with autism might also have ADHD. And it wasn't even until the release of the DSM-5 in 2013 that someone could officially be diagnosed with both. However, the debate in the medical community over that exclusionary rule goes back further than that. It had long been suspected that the two conditions frequently coincided, but it wasn't included in the previous version of the diagnostic manual for fear that autism would be underdiagnosed. Researchers were afraid that autism-related inattentiveness would be confused with ADHD. Kids with autism did have some attention issues, but it was related more to shifting their attention away from their narrow range of interests as opposed to the ADHD difficulty of getting the kids' attention and keeping them on track. So the community figured that forcing clinicians to pick one condition or the other would require them to scrutinize subtle behaviors like that more carefully. They wanted to be sure that kids who could benefit from autism treatments like social, speech, and occupational therapies weren't being misdiagnosed. This caused many doctors who identified ADHD in their autism patients to prescribe stimulant meds off-label because their hands were tied in regard to providing a formal diagnosis of someone having both at the same time. The growing evidence for the overlap between the two grew too big to ignore, and it was acknowledged that denying the existence of both from a medical standpoint prevented many from receiving proper treatment. Duh. There's also a lot of research identifying shared underlying genetic risk factors for people with autism and attention deficit disorder. One study found risk variants that are common in both disorders, and acknowledging the co-occurrence in the DSM-5 might benefit further studies on these genetic links. So now let's get into the meat and potatoes of what it might look like to have both, and I'm going to kick it off by sharing some memes called What Having ADHD and Autism Feels Like that I think did a pretty good job of describing how having having both can feel. I want to give full credit to their creator, Autistic Qualia, and I'll put a link to her Instagram page in the description if you want to go over there and follow her. You can also find these on my website, neurodivergent.com. Now, don't worry, if you're one of my people that just listen to my videos podcast style, these memes are essentially just text, so you're not missing out on anything, but let's go through them. Each picture has two arrows pointing to each other to show the dichotomy between certain traits, with labels to show which ones belong to autism, which ones belong to ADHD, and which ones belong to both. For the ones that belong to either ADHD or autism, I'm going to go more into detail on what those traits can look like under each condition separately, then explore what it looks like when someone has both traits together, because these traits are often contrarian in nature. For the ones belonging to both, it's not the traits that we need to explore, but rather the different causes. Because on the outside, the resultant behaviors look similar, and we often refer to this as crossover or overlap, but the motive or cause of those behaviors is different for each condition. Clear as mud? Fabulous. Let's go. The first one says ADHD, making spontaneous plans. Autism, getting very upset if those plans are interrupted. Novelty-seeking behavior is commonplace in ADHD. People with this condition oftentimes get bored of doing the same thing over and over again because they have less diffusion of dopamine in their brains, leading them to have less satisfaction out of too much routine. Whereas people with autism rely on ritualized routines and patterns of behavior to minimize that anxiety caused by uncertainty and unpredictability. When you have both, you often have the ability to step outside of your routine and make spontaneous plans. But then we tend to envelop that spontaneity within our need for routine. That can look like bringing certain elements of our routine into that plan, or becoming so fixated on how that spontaneous idea is supposed to go after having it that disruptions or cancellations become upsetting. And in many cases, that spontaneous activity can become quickly overwhelming, leading that individual to want to get back to normalcy and routine. I had touched on this a little bit in my second video describing my traits. I talked about how I could absolutely make spontaneous plans. I feel like I could simulate that scene from Yes Man, where Jim Carrey walks into the airport and asks the gate agent to give him a ticket on the next plane out of there, wherever it was going. But while I was there, I would still need to engage in certain elements of my routine, or it would throw off my entire day, and it wouldn't take long for me to want to get back home, to get back to normalcy and routine. So to summarize, when you have both, you might be able to make plans that are outside of your routine, but once you make them, you feel the same anxiety of routine disruption if those plans are interfered with. In the next one, we have ADHD, struggling to organize. Autism, having a strong need for order. We tend to think of organization as just the general tidiness of our surroundings, but it goes a lot deeper than that. Organization can also encompass planning, prioritization, punctuality, goal-oriented behaviors, and task completion. These are all executive functions, and both sides struggle with executive functioning as a general rule. We know that people with ADHD struggle with organizational skills, but the cause isn't exactly clear. We just know they mostly all do it. One model suggests it's the result of impaired working memory, while another identifies lack of immediate stimulus reinforcement as a driving factor. Regardless of the why, ADHDers oftentimes find themselves looking for their car keys inside their messy house, trying to get to their kid's PTA meeting that they just remembered they had all of 5 minutes ago, while their dog is staring up at them with sad eyes, wondering why he wasn't fed that morning. Again, whereas someone with autism has an insistence on sameness and an inflexible adherence to routines. This propensity for order extends to minute details, like the placement of objects. So they might have more organized homes and workspaces. Everything has to be in its place, and don't you dare touch their staplers.
I believe you have my stapler.
When you have both, your disorganization can show up strongly in some areas, while your need for order can show up strongly in other areas. For me personally, my strong need for order leads me to have a compulsive need to keep my house tidy and in order. Everything has to be in its place, and I can't relax if everything isn't where it's supposed to be. And once objects have a place in my home, it's hard for me to imagine them going anywhere else. It means I keep my financials organized in spreadsheets with corresponding numbers for expense receipts. I file my taxes early with an overabundance to attention to detail, and my bills are always paid on time. However, it leads me to seeming scatterbrained and disorganized in other areas like schedules, time management, constant procrastination, task avoidance, inability to properly follow instructions, and so on. And how that distribution of disorganization and order pans out will differ from person to person. Some of y'all out there may not be able to keep your house clean to save your life and struggle to manage your finances, but you might be super punctual, goal-oriented, manage your time better, and get necessary tasks done. Whatever this order to disorder ratio looks like for you, it might mean people will doubt your diagnosis because you can't have ADHD if you have any semblance of order and organization. But you can't be autistic if you don't follow ritualized patterns of behavior in every area of your life. The next one reads, ADHD, enticed by novel foods. Autism, hypercritical of food tastes and textures. People with ADHD might be enticed to try new or unique foods to satisfy their novelty-seeking side. They may be willing to eat almost anything, have a desire to try new things, and might get bored of eating the same foods over and over again. On the other hand, those with autism are more likely to eat the same foods over and over again, and they might avoid a large majority of foods based on taste, textures, and smells because of their hypersensitivities to sensory input. So when you have both, it could look like getting tired of eating the same foods over and over again, but also having a limited range of food options because you have heightened sensory sensitivities. Or it could look like wanting to eat the same foods over and over again due to a need for sameness and routine, but not necessarily having sensory sensitivity. So you're not averse to trying new things. For me personally, I fall into that latter category because I don't struggle with being hypercritical of foods based on sensory sensitivities. I have a pretty varied palate and will eat almost anything. I could be adventurous with trying new things like fried iguana while I'm on vacation in Mexico, for example. But I do tend to eat the same things over and over again due to my need for sameness and routine. And while even neurotypicals have meal rotations they put on repeat, it goes so much deeper than that for most of us. Like once we figure out how to create the perfect salad at home, it doesn't even occur to us that we could try making it a different way. As you could imagine, having this dichotomy could make meal planning pretty difficult, and you won't meet the stereotypical autistic criteria if you're willing to eat almost anything, but you won't seem like the typical ADHDer either if most textures and smells make you a picky eater. Okay, let's move on to the next one. ADHD, wanting new experiences. Autism, wanting to stick to what I know and like. Yet another form of the contradicting traits between ADHD and autism. We all know by now that people with ADHD often exhibit novelty-seeking and risk-taking behaviors, whereas autistic people exhibit distress at small changes, have difficulty with transitions, and have rigid thinking patterns. But in case you haven't realized by now, this isn't a video about just autism or just ADHD. It's about having both. So just imagine having these two traits together. What would that look like? Well, it could look like wanting something new and novel, so you push yourself to go hang out with new people or to try a new restaurant. Then feeling overwhelmed by the social interactions and being disappointed because that new restaurant you decided to try doesn't have any of the foods you typically eat. It's basically having constant internal conflict on a daily basis. Moving on, we have ADHD, hyperfixating on a wide variety of topics. Autism, also having long-term special interests. A lot of times we picture the conventional autistic person as having one type of special interest that they stick to for their entire life. People with autism can and do have a highly restricted, fixated interest on a single subject or topic that are abnormal in intensity or focus. It could last for years or even a lifetime. Whereas we picture the typical ADHD person going all in on a particular project or idea with every ounce of passion and intensity they have within them, getting approximately 1/4 of the way through, then entirely moving on to the next new shiny project or idea. When you have both, it could look like having one long-term special interest that makes you seem grounded, but you might quickly jump from one idea to the next with almost everything else. It can make a person feel guilty because they never really become an expert on just one thing, but instead take on this odd form of someone who is a jack of all trades and master of none. Next up, we have ADHD, forgetting steps and plans. Autism, needing plans to execute perfectly. A person with ADHD often has challenges with short-term memory, which causes them to do things like reading the instructions on a recipe box, throwing that box away, realizing they remembered absolutely nothing they read, and having to immediately retrieve that box from the trash can. For example, other people, not me. I've never done that. Studies suggest it's because their brain isn't as efficient at separating relevant details from unimportant ones in order to create or recall memories. They might also fail to follow through on instructions and leave tasks incomplete. Or they can have difficulty carefully reading instructions that require sustained mental effort, which makes them tempted to simply skim over them. I'm looking directly at you, ADHDers. You know who you are. Just a side note to all you companies out there, it would be the bee's knees if y'all could put some instruction manuals out there that are pictures only for us attention-challenged individuals, okay? Whereas a person with autism can exhibit a high attention to detail, commit them to memory, and can map out steps and sequences in a plan to an impressive level of detail. And deviating from the flight plan is a quick way to invite a meltdown because it goes against their rigid thinking patterns and inflexible adherence to routines. If you had just ADHD, you might not be as bothered by plans not executing perfectly. If you had just autism, you would be less likely to forget steps and plans. So if you have both, it can look like having a rigid need for everything to go just how you had it in your head, but having difficulty with working memory, leading to mistakes, which leads to distress because things didn't go exactly how they were supposed to go. You need things to go a certain way, but your brain has trouble making that happen. Following that, we have both struggling with emotional dysregulation and autism, being a logical and analytical thinker. While the cause of emotional dysregulation for both might differ, the end result looks similar. People with ADHD struggle with emotional regulation because their amygdala gets overloaded and relays that message to their cerebral cortex, which is the point your brain is supposed to stop and think things through rather than overreacting. But that connection hasn't been eating its Wheaties, so it's not as strong as it should be. Thus, one's reactions often seem disproportionate to its cause, and it can take them longer than normal to calm back down. It's like their brains think that losing their wallet is just as dangerous to their ongoing existence as encountering a hungry bear in the woods, because everything seems to trigger that fight or flight response. Whereas a person with autism might have emotional dysregulation because of sensory overwhelm, social and communication challenges, and need for repetitive behaviors. They also oftentimes have difficulty labeling and identifying their emotions, which can add to that frustration. The visible traits of emotional dysregulation in an autistic person are often referred to as a meltdown, which is frequently mistaken as a temper tantrum by outside observers. However, people with autism are also usually logical and analytical thinkers, and I don't think I need to do too much explaining to describe how being logical and analytical can clash with being emotional. So if you had just autism alone, there would likely already be some inner turmoil there because your logical side might think that emotions serve little to no purpose, and your analytical side would prefer to seek out solutions-oriented approaches rather than giving attention to emotions. It's an ongoing joke that women often tell their husbands, "I don't want a solution, I just want you to listen." That wouldn't make a ton of sense to an autistic person. People with ASD are also more likely to have delayed processing when it comes to emotions, which could make them seem like they don't care after the death of a loved one, for example, or they might not give you an immediate response to your expression of grief and frustration. But at the same time, they have these emotional outbursts when things don't go as planned or when they've been socializing too long in a noisy, crowded environment. So you could see how this could lead to seemingly self-contradictory behaviors because they respond excessively to some situations and insufficiently to other situations. Whereas a person with just ADHD might be more likely to show an immediate emotional reaction to stimuli or situations on a more consistent basis. So a person with just ADHD might seem more reactive and emotional, whereas a person with just autism could seem less reactive and less emotional. When you have both, the possible causes of dysregulation is expanded. It could be that flabby cerebral cortex to amygdala connection, or it could be sensory overwhelm. But regardless of the cause, it can sometimes seem like a stark contradiction to that logical and analytical mindset. All right, up next, ADHD, struggling to retain information. Both, wanting to learn everything. This one hits a little too close to home for me for sure. I tend to become interested in a wide range of topics that I start dedicating hours of research to. An example, anytime I fly on an airplane anywhere, be it for work or vacation, I suddenly find myself overly fascinated with all things aviation related. Why? I listen to the ATC chatter on the plane in my headphones. Before exiting the plane, I have secret wishes of being invited to go back to look at the cockpit. I want to meet the captain. Then when I get home, I consume hours of podcasts about aviation-related information. When I was most recently in that phase, my husband joked that he could find me wherever I was in the house just by following the sounds of
My uniform Papa, climbing chain 2,600.
2,600, uniform puff.
And uniform Papa, flight heading of 260.
260, uniform puff.
coming from my phone. But after listening to hours upon hours of aviation disaster documentaries, random ATC chatter, and technical stuff from YouTubers like 74 Gear and Mentor Pilot, what could I tell you about airplanes and aviation? I will listen to so much about a single subject at a time, but for some reason, I can only retain like 5% of it.
Curses, working memory deficit.
I've often said that if I could remember even half of the facts that I enjoy researching, I could become a powerful evil genius. But you can all rest easy knowing I'm just your non-threatening, slightly below average individual who won't be trying to take over the world anytime soon. Whereas those with just autism have less difficulty with working memory, so they're able to commit more facts to their long-term memory, which lends to the autistic savant stereotype. You know, like the little boy who can tell you the scientific names for every type of dinosaur, or that grown-up doctor who has a superhuman level of expertise about one single subject, who can robotically recite every known fact about it, like they're reading from an encyclopedia. While the ADHD people are digging through their trash cans for that recipe box to reread the instructions they just read 5 seconds ago. So when you have both, it can basically pan out to being really interested in researching topics and most of that research going in one ear and out the other. The next meme says ADHD misses details and makes mistakes on boring tasks. Autism notices small details and points out others' mistakes. A person with just ADHD often fails to give close attention to details, leading them to make careless mistakes in schoolwork, at work, or with other activities. They also have a propensity to dislike or avoid tasks that require sustained mental effort over a long period of time. Whereas someone with autism often notices small details and recognizes patterns. So if you have both, you basically come out looking like a hypocrite because your autism side is bothered by the mistakes of others and feels a strong need to correct them. But your ADHD side means you have the propensity to miss small details yourself. And one might wonder how one could notice small details but yet miss details at the same time. But let me tell you, the two exist together in perfect disharmony. Your ADHD side will often notice details about things you're interested in and ignore details about things your brain doesn't find interesting. And your autism side can lead you to get so caught up in small, unimportant details that you fail to see the bigger picture for things that actually matter, which can look like missing big details. But if you had just ADHD, you might be slightly less rigid about the mistakes of others. Then finally, under both, we have becoming easily understimulated and becoming easily overstimulated. Having difficulty sitting still, but being hypersensitive to other people fidgeting, and interrupting others when they're busy, but hate being bothered while in hyperfocus. Now, I'm not going to go too much into detail on these last traits because similar to what we went over in the emotional dysregulation section, while the causes might differ, the behavior outcomes often look similar. As discussed, overstimulation in ASD can come from sensory overwhelm, sensory challenges, and need for sameness, whereas in ADHD, it can come from your brain taking in too much at once. The two seem so similar, but they are slightly different. One might come from sounds or lights, whereas the other one might come from too much information coming in for planning a vacation and having to make many decisions for each option and possibility, for example. The cause of understimulation for ADHD can come from receiving less positive stimulation for ordinary activities, whereas in ASD, it might come from not being able to engage in self-stimulatory behavior, which is the perfect segue into this section talking about fidgeting. People with autism engage in stimulatory behavior, or stimming for short, which results in repetitive motions to regulate themselves. People with ADHD who also have the hyperactivity component tend to feel a palpable energy buzzing through their bodies that they need to relieve by wringing their hands, shaking their feet, or tapping a pencil. And to some degree, even neurotypicals engage in stimulatory behaviors. However, you might be irritated by the tapping or shaking of others because of the sensory overwhelm of autism, or the added distractions when you already struggle to focus with ADHD. And last but not least, hyperfocus might be one of the biggest and most apparent crossovers between the two conditions. For people with one or both conditions, they tend to get overly irritated if they're interrupted while in hyperfocus on a preferred activity. So, why would they interrupt others then if they themselves hate being interrupted? Well, autism might cause an individual to be somewhat aloof to the needs of those around them, and the hyperactivity component of ADHD might cause people to interrupt or intrude on others and have difficulty waiting their turn. It's difficult in a lot of these situations to tell what is driven by the ADHD, what's driven by the autism, or if it's just some weird combination of the two. It'll often depend on the situation and how ADHD presents in that individual to determine what drives a certain behavior. But regardless, you can see how it could be especially difficult for someone on the outside to determine what is driving these overlapping behaviors, which is part of the reason diagnoses can be so difficult for even a lot of professionals if they don't know what they're looking for. If you're still wondering if you could have both, allow me to showcase some extremes that might be helpful to someone just beginning their research journey. First, people with just ADHD might be more sociable and outgoing and may not get as overwhelmed by social activity, whereas someone with autism is usually more introverted and struggles with social communication and interaction. So if you identify with a bunch of ADHD traits but find yourself struggling in social situations or trying to avoid them entirely and you don't know why, you could have both. Secondly, people with ADHD can seem more carefree and emotional, while people with autism appear to be more reserved and less emotional. So if you identify with a lot of the traits of ADHD, but you feel like you kind of have this serious, logical, and analytical side to you, you might have both. Thirdly, people with ADHD may engage in risk-taking behavior and breaking rules, while people with autism are often seen as rigid, risk-avoidant, and rule-following. So if you're like me, you might have engaged in some risk-taking behaviors as a teenager. As an adult, that willingness to assume risk could look like entrepreneurship, for example. In addition to this, you might seem rebellious and willing to break rules if you feel like those rules are immoral or unjust. But you might also be considered somewhat of a square because you're a rigid rule follower at the same time. And finally, you have other basic criteria of both, like abnormalities in eye contact and having sensory sensitivities with things like light, sound, and smells for autism, but is also often on the go as if driven by a motor, have difficulty paying attention, talk excessively, interrupt others, or have difficulty waiting your turn for ADHD.
That was a mouthful.
Now, keep in mind that most of those suggestions are not diagnostic criteria. They don't definitively describe how each condition works, nor will these traits apply to everyone who has one or both diagnoses. I basically just wanted to do a 1,000-foot overview to provide possible ideas of what it could look like for someone to have both. Honestly, how the two present together feels like such a different animal entirely. I sometimes feel like it deserves its own name and classification in the next rendition of the DSM. At the end of the day, one of the biggest challenges faced by those of us who have the dual diagnosis currently is that oftentimes we're not believed by the outside world, because there's so many stereotypical traits for one or the other that we may not exhibit. You can't be autistic if you're not overly picky with your food, don't have an encyclopedic knowledge about your special interests, have the ability to be highly sociable and talkative at times, can engage in spontaneous activities, or have a family and a job. And you can't be ADHD if you can pay your bills on time, have a strong need for order and routine, experience distress with change, have long-term special interests, or seem shy and introverted. And the dichotomy of many of these traits make us appear balanced and normal on the outside when really they'll never know just how much internal confusion and conflict we feel on a day-to-day basis. There's this feeling of push and pull in so many areas of our lives that can make us seem hypocritical and confusing to the people around us. It's like that all too relatable meme where a neurotypical person says, I can do whatever, and an autistic person says, I need routine to function. An ADHD person says, I function in chaos. And that poor guy with both autism and ADHD jumps in and says, wait, you guys can function? Having both autism and ADHD can make a lot of us feel like we're failing at almost everything in life, but maybe we should begin looking at ourselves like we're kind of just a little bit awesome in a bunch of different areas instead. So I'll end it there. But before you go, if you could hover your finger over that like button, then slowly descend that finger until it touches a like button, I'd really appreciate it. It costs you $0. It won't take up any space in your home, and it won't enroll you in any annoying marketing emails, but it will really help me out in the YouTube algorithm. And if you'd like to share your feelings about what it's like to have both, please share that in the comments section below. Your comments mean a lot to me. Honestly, every time I get one, it's kind of like the excitement and joy of receiving an Amazon package I forgot I had ordered. And yes, I do read each and every one. And as always, I welcome you to share your own experiences for a future video through my website, neurodivergent.com. Until next time, bye for now. Mwah. Did you stick around hoping I'd do some kind of funny outro at the end? Well, I'm not gonna do it. I mean, I guess by doing an outro to tell you I'm not doing an outro is me kind of doing an outro. So I guess you're welcome or whatever. Sheesh, you're so spoiled.